Morning, everybody. I think we're going to get started here with our first panel. So welcome back. I'm glad we got the virtual coffee hallway experience there, the break in between. Grateful to be speaking to you. I'm Darcy Lindberg. I'm in Amiskwichi, Waskahegan, so Edmonton. Grateful to be a part of this. So I just want to extend my gratefulness to the organizers and for putting this together and the ability to share what we're doing here today. So this first session, we're going to be thinking about Indigenous territories and the implications on Indigenous food security, sovereignty, food relationships. Territoriality it's a very important part of this, obviously, when we think about food sourcing, food policy. So we're going to weave in some stories, some experiences and relationships here in this panel. The colonial imposition on Indigenous territories and the impact it has had on Indigenous people. And also we're thinking about reclamations as well. So I'm really grateful for the three panelists who have agreed to join me in this session here to share their integral stories, their relationships and experiences here. So I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of us here and then allow time in their sessions to give more of an introduction as well here. So first is Alan Hanna, and Alan can give us a wave or a smile. Alan is an assistant professor at the University of Victoria's Faculty of Law. He teaches trans-systemic contract law in the Joint Juris Doctorate Indigenous program, and also teaches lands, rights, and governance, and also about Indigenous laws and methods. Alan also practices as well in these areas too. So grateful to have Alan on this panel. Next is Hannah, and Hannah, can you give us a wave? Or a smile or whatever you want. Hannah is the executive director of the Sierra Club of British Columbia. She's practiced public interest environmental law and also worked as a researcher on projects involving Anishinaabe and Coast Salish legal orders. And that was through the Indigenous Laws Research Unit at the University of Victoria as well. And then finally, we have Rebeca Macias Gimenez. So Rebeca recently defended her PhD through, again, the Faculty of Law at the University of Victoria. Her research focuses on land and water governance, environmental decision-making about energy infrastructure, and how this intersects with social and environmental justice as well. And then me, I am a assistant professor at the University of Alberta, and I am I teach constitutional law as well as courses on Indigenous legal orders, Indigenous ecological governments, and also on treaties as well. So grateful we're going to have this experience to share with us, with you all here. So the one thing I'll say is I love the open chat format that we have here, the open office meeting that we're doing this in. So I'm going to be moderating. So if you do have questions flowing throughout, please put them in the chat and I'll be keeping an eye on those and collecting those. And once our presentations occur, I will put those forth to the group. When we get towards the end, there might be a chance to speak questions as well. And so we'll kind of open up, just trying to keep organized in that way as well. Each of us are going to speak for about 15 minutes as a maximum, and there will be time at the end to ask these questions as well. So without me talking more, you're going to hear from me more at the end here. I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Thanks, Darcy. Thanks for the introduction. So as Darcy mentioned, my name is Alan Hanna. I'm Blackfoot on my father's side. I'm Scottish and French on my mother's side. And I'm connected to the Northern community, Williams Lake, the Williams Lake First Nation, through marriage. And I'm coming to you, I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Osage people on the peninsula of the southern Vancouver Island. So I've got a PowerPoint here. I'll get this set up. Oh, it disappeared. You know, you'd think that after teaching a full course online, I would have this down by now, but okay, technical difficulties already. Let's see. Probably just going to have to close this and open it up again. Rebooting usually solves many problems.
Yeah, my experience, Alan, is no matter how many times we do this, something always comes up and it's like, wow.
Yeah. Okay, we'll try this again. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing food sovereignty by referencing the territories of the Tashkotene Nation, just to give people who haven't spent much time on the West Coast. So the Tashkotene Nation is here. This is a language map, which I think more generally reflects the territories, I think, better than, you know, delineation, red line delineations. And of course, you can see Vancouver Island, and down at the bottom, Victoria being around here, Vancouver. So it's in the central interior of what is now the province of British Columbia. So that's the area. Tashkotene people rely on salmon that swim upstream, up the Fraser that goes right through Vancouver and all the way up through a number of different territories. So given the short duration, I'm gonna just kind of provide a high level gloss on the tensions around food sovereignty and how that's confounded by the imposition of colonial or crown sovereignty. So to get there, I'm gonna talk about how food sovereignty may be understood in Indigenous terms, kind of the sources of that, and how that is fundamentally diminished under, or has been anyway, diminished under Canadian law. So I'm going to provide a bit of a roadmap here. I'm going to approach this topic through the assertions made by various groups, through the rights, the perspectives about the inherent right and the rights under Canadian law, and then the assumptions that are made to kind of get at rights recognition. And this is an image from the Hanigwitine, and that's Mount Saitlos in the background. So we'll start with assertions. And Tashkotene have never ceded or surrendered their land. They've never entered treaty, and as such have always asserted or maintained to exercise authority over their lands. So here's the declaration. It was first produced in 1983 and then reproduced in 1998. So the Tashkotene Nation affirms, asserts, and strives to exercise full control over our traditional territories and over the government within our lands. Our jurisdiction to govern our territory and our people is conferred upon us by the Creator to govern, maintain, and protect the traditional territory in accordance with the natural law for the benefit of all living things existing on our land for this generations and for those yet unborn. We have been victims of colonization by Britain, Canada, and the province of British Columbia. We insist upon our right to decolonize and drive these governments from our land. And there's been a process of that which has been ongoing. So this assertion embraces a basic fact that one that's been recognized, the Supreme Court of Canada a few decades ago, that Indigenous peoples were here when Europeans arrived. And each group had their own way of understanding and expressing their relationships to the lands and waters that sustained them. So this authority is often derived from a gift from the Creator, and oral tradition typically depicts a complex set of relationships with different places and entities which establish the origin of enduring laws, obligations, and commitments to one another on the land. So when Europeans arrived, anthropologists, priests, and others learned and recorded many of these origin narratives, but they didn't translate to the new colonial authorities as being a statement about jurisdiction or independence. They were merely passed off as being fantastic myths or legends. It's pretty convenient when new people arrive and want to impose their own laws, which would then in turn negate and displace existing authority. So the assertion of Crown sovereignty is powerful. It seems sufficient to confer valid authority on the Crown. And really what that means is these assertions are important. They matter. They mean something. So after a century of resistance, the new legal system in Canada, the changing legal system, begins to recognize that original authority. And they recognize it under the language of rights. So we see the inherent right in the Teshkotine Declaration. Jurisdiction to govern our territory and our people is conferred upon us by the Creator to govern, maintain, and protect the traditional territory. That's the inherent right. If you go to the CERNAC website and look up self-governance, you'll find this statement about the inherent right. The Government of Canada recognizes the inherent right of self-government as an existing Aboriginal right under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. So 1982 includes the recognition of the right to govern themselves in relation to matters that are internal to their communities, integral to the unique cultures, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions, and with respect to their special relationship to land and the resources. And that's the key point. That's what I'm going to start hammering at. So with respect to the special relationship, what is special? What is special about it? We'll get there, to the land and resources. So, of course, everybody's familiar by now with Section 35 rights, the Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35, but there are other laws, Indigenous laws outlining this right or the ability to rely on the land for a people's existence. Indigenous peoples have legal obligations to non-human relations, so animals and fish and plants, under their own legal orders. And I've studied many of these in context with a number of different nations. They exist to ensure the continued viability of species, which has the reciprocal effect of ensuring a stable, reliable food supply, leading to the longevity of a nation and its communities. So what are we talking about? Food sovereignty. Currently, there's a semblance that some manner of self-determination, quite short of sovereignty, which may incorporate the management of land and waters. But there are several assumptions that need to be overcome before we can actually reach this kind of full sense of food sovereignty. And some of these have been overcome. And so we'll look at some of these assumptions. So first of all, initially the province of BC and the federal government assumed they held jurisdiction to regulate hunting and fishing for everyone living in the province. And the government learned through cases such as early as White and Bob, Calder, Sparrow, Vanderpeet, to name a few, that their assumptions were incorrect about this. The government learned they did not have the jurisdiction to regulate Aboriginal harvesting practices. So what was initially believed to be applied to all, now only applied to non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people who were hunting or fishing outside of their traditional territory. The next assumption then is that the Crown, in the right of the province and the federal government, has sole jurisdiction over species management, which means then the ability to make decisions about the land and water, or in other words, the habitats that provide for the viability of these species. So there's the logical connection between the relationship to hunting and fishing and the land that provides for the sustainability, the viability of species. And the courts haven't fully weighed in on this aspect of Aboriginal and treaty rights, as including the ability to manage land or water as a right and as a part of carrying out hunting and fishing practices. So under Indigenous laws, the relationships with fish and animals are deeply entwined with the lives of people, the land, and the water. Obligations to ensure species viability are rife in oral traditions, examples of which there are many. I don't have time to go into them here. Suffice it to say, the ability to carry out the right to hunt and fish as formerly, and that's specific language used in the Fort Victoria treaties here on Vancouver Island, means from an Indigenous legal logic, the ability to manage species and by necessity, the land and water of those species. So I'm just really making sure that that's grounded. As I alluded to earlier, this is largely untested in court. However, the court has recognized that hunting activities reasonably incidental to, and that's the court's language, reasonably incidental to the practice, tradition, or customs anchoring the right could be protected. So for example, building a shelter to carry out a hunt, transporting hunting gear to a hunting ground, to teach the practice of hunting to younger generations, all fall within the scope of the treaty harvesting rights. And by extension, I would argue they would fall within the scope of Aboriginal rights. So we can reasonably see that, you know, just taking the animal doesn't necessarily encompass the right. So why wouldn't the most important aspect of the Indigenous practice of hunting or fishing also fall within the scope of being incidental to, even though I would argue it's much more than just incidental. And that's the management of the resource itself, the management of its habitat. Newly arrived Europeans assumed Indigenous groups were merely reactive and followed food around on empty stomachs. And we know nothing can be farther from the truth. People have always been proactive, managing relationships to the land and to non-human relations to ensure continued availability and viability of species. And we can see this across many oral histories. To date, the right to hunt and fish still seems limited to taking of the species only and things that might be incidentally or reasonably incidental to that. Which in my opinion, and to use the language of Justice Vickers, is an impoverished view of the right. So how can the right exist without the authority of a nation to manage their lands? And that's the main question that I'm putting out there. The Crown simply assumes their sovereignty is a superior and the only power to manage species, which again, including habitat use or and resource extraction. So that's where the two worlds collide, and that's a nod to Leroy Little Bear. And quite often, the Crown has proved inadequate at managing species at sustainable levels. And we only have to look at the East Coast cod fisheries, the herring and salmon fisheries that are collapsing on the West Coast here, the disappearing caribou herds in the Selkirks, the Rockies, and elsewhere. And what happens then is when the province, this is one example, failed to effectively protect moose in the Teshkotin Nen after the fires of 2017, the nation imposed their own ban on moose hunting, responding to their legal obligations to the species under Dechendelese 10, so under their own laws. There is hope with the legal recognition, finally, of Aboriginal title, as Teshkotin have begun occupying the legislative field with their own laws presented in a form familiar to Canadian governments. So Nalga Dechendelese 10, so their wildlife law was enacted, and subsequently the Estela Sturgeon River law. So the real problem with these laws, and this is kind of the, I guess, an elephant or a moose in the room, is that these laws don't account for a broader regional management of a matter that directly impacts things like salmon runs that go all the way down to the coast. So we have, the West Coast commercial fishery that arguably the Teshkotin jurisdiction wouldn't extend to that, or climate change. So things that are really outside of the scope of the ability of a nation to manage and control, at least beyond the traditional territories. And so these are really topics for a longer discussion. So just by way of conclusion, I'll just leave you with this question. How may Indigenous groups exercise food sovereignty without the authority to manage their lands and species upon which they're in relation for sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And I like the metaphor of a moose in a room. Brings it a little bit more close to home here as well. And so in the interest of time, we're just going to roll right along here and going to call upon Hannah now.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Alan, for that incredible presentation and for really laying out in such a clear and powerful way the legal foundation for a lot of the issues that we're discussing in different ways on this panel this morning. So my name is Hannah, and I come from English and Scottish ancestors, and I'm calling in today from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and it's a huge honor to be part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the other panels and presentations that are part of this conference. So I'm just going to also share my screen here. So let me just get this set up. Okay, does that work for everyone?
Yeah, I can see your screen, Hannah.
Okay, great. All right, so my presentation today is actually a little bit more coming from a personal perspective. And so this is about the presentation that I'm going to share is more kind of a case study in my own navigation through looking at food systems and the way that colonial food systems and Indigenous food systems and Indigenous food sovereignty have been coexisting in different kinds of tension together in the Secwépemc territorial region, which is where my family settled a few generations ago when my ancestors originally came from England and Scotland. And over the years, I have learned kind of bits and pieces, both of my family's story, but also how it's interacted and caused disruptions to the Indigenous food systems that were operating at the time that my ancestors came and that also continue to operate. And so I'm a little nervous sharing this because I think when you know, we explore stories that are so close to our own identities and our own families, there's a lot more blind spots that we can have. And so yeah, I'm excited to have the opportunity to share this with you, and a little bit nervous as well. So I just wanted to start my presentation by referring to a report that just came out a couple of days ago that's phenomenal from the Yellowhead Institute. And the report is called the Cash Back paper, and I've just begun to read it. I haven't gone through it yet, but I think it's such an important report that's been put out. And I think it has a lot of, for me, it has a lot of relevance in terms of understanding some of the economic dimensions of my own settler family's positioning and understanding how it's interacted with Indigenous economies and some of the injustices that have been perpetrated, and sets out a really powerful framework for some of the pathways forward as people are working to restore justice in some of these areas and to support Indigenous sovereignty and food sovereignty moving forward. And I just wanted to read a quote from the introduction of the report that really resonated with me. And so this passage from the introduction, which is on Indigenous economies, says, "It is important that we do not talk about a single economy in this country, because the Canadian economy is not the same thing as the many other types of economies that organize Indigenous lives. In English, economy is the wealth and resources of a region. But economics has a deeper meaning. It is a word that originally comes from the ancient Greek, combining home and accounts, which is not so different from Indigenous conceptions. Indigenous economies are grounded in the social, political, and ecological relationships to which they are held accountable. An Indigenous economy, as Stolo economist Dara Kelly and scholar Christine Woods describe, is the one that protects the well-being of the people, the culture, and its worldviews. Ethical Indigenous economies must not be subsumed to Canadian economic well-being." So I think to me that framing of the issue really resonated, and I think you'll see why as I move through my presentation here. So this picture, sorry, I've got my dog here with me. This picture that I'm showing on the screen is a picture of my great grandfather, Dick Askew, and he's standing in the front there. And this is a picture that's taken, I think, around 1919 or 1920, and it's in the land registry office in Kamloops, which is in the Okanagan Interior, also in the central interior. So on the map that Alan showed, this area is adjacent to the Secwépemc territory and also Silcotin territory. And so my great grandfather fought in the First World War, and white soldiers who fought in the war as Canadians were often granted land when they came back as some compensation. And that was a policy that was to benefit white settlers, and Indigenous soldiers who fought were not eligible. They were not a beneficiary of that policy. So this was the beginning of my family as a settler family being able to live in Secwépemc and Okanagan territory. So I just wanted to start with that picture. And there's a quote in the Cashback report that talks about the fact that for a lot of settlers, as the report puts it, policy-wise, they were starting on third base and sliding into home and calling that a victory because of the ways that the policies from the colonial state benefited them. And so I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind. So I wanted to start out with that. So my family, after my great-grandfather settled in the area, he ended up purchasing a butcher shop that was originally in Kamloops, and then he relocated it to Salmon Arm. And that butcher shop over generations was expanded into a grocery store called Askew's Foods, which still operates in the Secwépemc territory today. And both my father and sister work there. As myself in my 20s, I also worked briefly for our family business. And one of my jobs was to go and visit the different farmers that supplied our store with different kinds of foods that they grew on their farms from the local area. And through that job, I had the honor to meet this person in the next slide that I'm going to show you here. So this is a photo of Wolverine, or his English name is was William Ignis, and he is best known as one of the leaders of the Gustafson Lake standoff. So he was one of the Zapetan land defenders that was defending an unceded area of Secwépemc territory where sun dances were performed. And he was the victim of a large kind of show of force from the colonial state as they tried to stop those land defenders from protecting their unceded territory and their right to continue the Sundance ceremonies. And he was actually jailed for that for 6 years. And he passed away a few years ago, but even close to the time of his death, he was still calling on the Canadian government to do an inquiry into the unjust circumstances that led to his incarceration as a result of that incident. So he was also a farmer, and he grew a bunch of crops on his home, on his farm on the Adam Lake Reserve. And he sold some of those squash to our family store. And so I, as part of my job to go and meet and communicate with the farmers that sold us produce, I had the huge honor to be able to meet with him a few times at his home on the reserve. And he taught me a lot about the struggles of his people to be able to farm, as well as about the disruptions to their food sovereignty that had occurred as a result of settlers coming into their territory. So this is just a picture of the squash. So one of the things that Wolverine really emphasized to me were the issues around access to water and looking at water policy around irrigation and how that had impacted his ability and that of other people in his community to farm. So essentially what he explained to me is that as settlers in the late 1800s came into Secwepemc territory, the really healthy Indigenous food system that had been in place began to be threatened by the economic development activities of settlers. So some of that included, the creation of private property and putting up fences that disrupted the ability of some of the larger animals to be able to travel freely through the territory and affected their migration routes. The other huge thing was irrigation, and especially in some of the more water scarce areas, water was being diverted for the new fruit orchards that were being set up by settlers. And so that meant that, different plants and animals and birds had less access to those water sources. And then in turn, that created food scarcity for some of the different beings that that his community were relying on for their food sources. So as a result of that, it became necessary for his family, his ancestors, to begin to also start farming on the reserve lands in order to compensate for the disruption to the previous food systems. And so his family had also begun farming, but an issue was water, and irrigation licenses for water were routinely given to white settlers and not to the reserves or to Indigenous farmers. And this is something that Wolverine fought for his entire life. And he actually, in 1989, tried to start a lawsuit with 12 other families on the Adams Lake Indian Band Reserve. And what he was planning to sue the government for was for all of the profits that could have been made if they had been given water licenses equal to that of white farmers in the area, because their farms were much less productive because of not having those water licenses. And in the end, he didn't file the lawsuit because there was some fear about what kind of retribution there might be from the government or from other white settlers, but it was an issue that he really fought for his whole life. And for myself, in my 20s, visiting him on his farm, that was the first time that I, as a kind of settler in the area, had been aware of that history. And I started, after that conversation with him, I started doing some research and realized that actually there were a number of struggles and many Indigenous families that had been impacted by those unfair policies. So a couple of more well-known incidents are Paul Turbasket, who was an Okanagan person in 1911. He was actually jailed for watering his orchard after a license had been denied to him and instead given to the Similkameen Water Company. He was someone that actually went to jail for that. And similarly, there was another Okanagan woman named Mary, I don't have her last name, who a few years later was also jailed for chopping up a water flume that was taking water away and being diverted to settlers. So there's a long history of struggle over how those irrigation rights have been allocated, and it's directly connected to these issues of food sovereignty in the area. This is a picture of the late Dr. Mary Thomas, whose work probably many of you are familiar with, and she also worked closely with the ethnobotanist, Dr. Nancy Turner. And Dr. Mary Thomas's work has also taught me a lot. She also talks about how her family's traditional gathering practices were displaced by settler economic activity. And she talks specifically about how her mother actually had to start her own vegetable garden, but also take on work helping to construct the settler irrigation systems in the area because they couldn't make enough money to support the family. And she talks about how hard that was emotionally, spiritually on her mother, having to, being forced to sort of actively participate in the building of a different food economy that undermined their own Secwepemc Indigenous food sovereignty at the time. And so Dr. Mary Thomas in her lifetime did an incredible amount to rebuild the Secwepemc Indigenous food economy and to really educate so many of us, both settler and Indigenous, about the importance of that economy and restoring the kind of ecological well-being the region as well that had been hurt by some of the settler economic activity on her nation's territories. This is a picture actually of, this is the land that was formerly the land that Paul Turbasket, who I mentioned before, farmed. And you can see there is just one tree remaining that he had farmed. It's an apricot tree and it's still there today. He lost most of his orchard because of not having access to the irrigation, but that one apricot tree survived and it's still there, kind of a reminder of that ongoing struggle. So I'm going to conclude here, but what I wanted to finish with is this is a piece of artwork that was done by my colleague at Sierra Club BC, Charlene George, and this artwork comes from Coast Salish territory on Vancouver Island, where our office is located. And so my colleague, Charlene, is a member of the Sauk community. And this piece that she's done is a piece that I think it's about the past, present, and future of the territory, of her people's territory. And what she has depicted in this and has been teaching us at Sierra Club BC and using this as an educational tool is about how to restore some of those respectful relationships that have been disrupted through some of the settler economic development projects on this territory. And a huge component of this is an interactive online tool. You can see it on our website, but a lot of what you can see in there talks about the relationships between beings and also the restoration of some of the food systems on Coast Salish territory. So I might be able to talk more about that in the questions, but I will conclude my talk here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah, for that and your the interlude with your dog as well. And I appreciate you telling that story about Wolverine. And I always appreciate these stories because it shows that sort of grounded work that we're doing, Indigenous people are doing in the background, even if they are in the front of these notorious land offenses that is occurring there. So I heard you tell that story to me before, and I appreciated hearing again here. Okay, so we're going to keep moving right along here. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebeca.
Thank you, Darcy. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, it sounds good, Rebeca.
Okay, good. My name is Rebeca Macias Gimenez. I am originally from Brazil. My heritage is from Europeans and also original peoples from what is today Venezuela. I've moved to Victoria 6 years ago to do the PhD, and now it looks like a cycle is ending. So I just defended my PhD and I'm happy about it. So I'm happy to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers and also thank Darcy for inviting me to take part of this panel, and thank my dear friends Alan and Hannah. So what I'm gonna share today is a little bit of part of my research with the PhD, but also part of the issues that I've been thinking about for future research. So I've taken upon myself the commitment of, in my academic work and my personal work as well, like my personal life, to kind of expose the issues that have been going on in the Amazon forest in Brazil. So that's part of my commitment as an academic. So today I'm not gonna share about the Canadian component of my research, but about the Brazilian component of my research. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Xingu River basin. It's in the Amazon, and the Bellamonte Hydro Dam, which was just built in that river. Some of the experiences of the Indigenous communities with disruptions caused by the dam and other correlated disruptions. And then I want to share a little bit about the bravery of the Shikkrin people, which is just one of the 9 Indigenous peoples of that region that were affected by the dam, and some of their experiences in reclaiming their authority over their territory and their food systems. And then I would like to conclude with some reflections and some questions that hopefully we can talk about in our discussion time. So the Xingu River Basin, it's one of the tributaries of the Amazon River, which is, as you probably know, one of the largest watersheds in the world. And the Xingu River Basin is a great component, contributes to that watershed. And you see where it's located in the map here in South America and the territory of what is today Brazil. And this watershed is actually formed, more than half of the watershed has been recognized by the Brazilian state as indigenous lands. So a lot of indigenous communities live in this watershed and depend on this watershed and its resources. But since the 60s, the 1960s, the Brazilian government has been looking into this region very strategically, because they believed that this area was very favoring of hydropower developments. And especially this area, sorry, and okay, full screen for everyone. Especially this area, it's a river band, and it was always seen as a place that would provide hydropower. So this is the Bellamonte Dam. This gray area is the area that's being flooded by the dam. It's almost 500 kilometers square of flooded area of this reservoir. And the intention is to produce a little over 100,000 megawatts. So it's a mega dam. And some of the disruptions that the dam has been causing is the slowing down of the river. So this area, this river band, was known by the rapids and the deep flowing channels, and the very intensive pulses of environmental flows that provided an important environment for fish habitats, for the fish of that region. And because of the dam, there's a slowing down of those pulses, which impacted the ability of fish habitats, and as a result, indigenous fishing practices. So this is a picture of the Bellamonte, the actual dam. And you can see it's pretty huge. Each one of those turbines, this was during construction, so not all of the turbines were already installed by then, but they are now. And you can see how huge it is compared to the little cars and even the truck on the bottom here compared to the dam. So this is a picture of some of the local species of fish which Indigenous peoples of the region relied on, and a lot of those species they have been affected by the dam, and some of them have been even extinguished because of those changes in the water flow in the river. So here are some experiences that when I did my field work in that region, some of the Indigenous peoples, they shared with me the effects that the dam has been having on their lives. So these are fishery communities, so they rely a lot on their fisheries, and in parts of the river there has been the flooding, but in other parts, as you know, the dam causes the dry up of like the downstream areas of the river. So in some Indigenous territories, the water has been a lot less. It has been scarce, and as a consequence, it has been warmer because it's not as fast as it used to be. So there's less oxygen for the fish to survive. So those communities, they shared with me that they used to choose what kind of fish that they were going to have that day for their dinner, and fish was abundant, but now they cannot choose. They just, whatever they catch is whatever they have for the day, and sometimes they don't even have any. And this last quote is a poem that one of the people that I talked with, he wrote this poem, and he shared with me like in a very emotional way. So I took upon myself the commitment of also sharing this with other people. So moving on. So besides the disruptions caused by the dam, of course, it's not just the dam. As you probably have heard on the news, there's a lot going on in the Amazon region right now, and also specifically in this watershed. So other disruptions that are related to the dam is illegal mining and land grabbing, especially because there was a huge influx of people coming to this region. And it's part of the ongoing colonization of the state to want to occupy this area with non-Indigenous settlers and create what they call development in the Amazon. And you probably have heard that there has been a great increase in deforestation, and also with the fires in the Amazon in the last couple of years, and especially with this new government, not new government, but the current government, they made like a name for themselves to deforest the Amazon region. There's also man camps because of the influx of workers to the region, and that represents great risks to Indigenous women. A great change in their food sources. So there's a lot of industrialized foods coming into communities that didn't have much relationship with settlers and with the city, but now because their traditional food sources have been affected, they rely more and more on industrialized food. So they go more often to the city and buy a lot of industrialized food in the city. And of course, mental health issues going on. So I don't know if you can see my arrow. This is the traditional land of the Shikkrin people, and this territory is called Trincheira do Bacajá. And I just wanted to focus on this as one example of things that are going on in this watershed. So this, in this region here, I have some relationship with one community, and I have been talking with them, and they have been sharing some of their experiences and some of their projects and dreams and expectations that they have for the future of their land. A few 2 years ago, the Shikkrin people, which is the people that live in that territory, they have been threatened, and this was not an isolated event. It's something that has been going on and still ongoing. They have been threatened by invaders coming into their territory, occupying, deforesting part of the territory, and logging, illegal logging and mining. So the Shikkrin people, they declared war to those invaders, and these news, they traveled the world, but were pretty well heard in Brazil in particular. So they declared war, and they traveled to the borders of their territory with their weapons. They had done an assembly and decided that they would do that. So the men traveled to the borders and confiscated chainsaws and some of the weapons of the invaders. And because of that, they have since then been threatened. Their lives have been threatened by those invaders. So there's a constant risk and fear that the invaders would come and harm the whole community. But even so, they decided to do this as a statement of their authority over their territory. So this was one of their acts, just declaring and reclaiming their authority over their territory. So these pictures here, the first one is just it's one community of this, the territory of the Shikkrin people. There are many communities. And the second photo is part of the logging that those invaders did in that region. So one community that, as I said, I have a relationship with is the Pikachaka community. And they have been sharing with me, and I have been trying to support some of their submitting requests for grants for their projects and things like that. So one of the projects they have been going on is a project regarding the cassava root production. So cassava root is a traditional food in Brazil in general, but specifically for those communities. So they have been strengthening the cycle of that root with permaculture. So combining the production of cassava with other native species in a way that would protect the forest and also guarantee their food source. So they produce the cassava flour for their consumption and also to commercialize outside of the community. And the second project is community-based monitoring. So they have been monitoring the Bacajá River, which is a tributary of the Xingu River. And it is one river that has been greatly affected by the Bellamonte Dam. The river is almost dried up during summer. It's very slow. They say that the river is much warmer than it used to be It's much shallower than it used to be. And of course, this affected their fishing practices. So less water and also the quality of the water is much worse because it's not able to run and dissolve the pollutants that are in the water. So here are just a few pictures that they shared with me. This is part of the community of the Pikachaka, the Shikkrin people. And the second photo is the inauguration of their oven, which is used to produce the cassava flour. So it was a happy day for them. They were celebrating here. So just to conclude, some of the reflections I've had with my PhD and now moving forward to future research as I begin a postdoc and thinking of those things and also how to support those communities as an academic is sometimes those economic and political pressures, they seem so great, unfathomable, like amazingly great, even to be fought against. But you also have those decentralized practices of reclamation of communities, and they seem small practices, but they are strong, and they have been having an effect. I also think a lot about the struggle and the resistance of the Shikkrin people and other people in the Amazon as tools of social activism and also of theory. And I've been thinking about this based on Linda Smith's work on decolonizing methodologies, as she talks about struggle as a tool of theory. And that's something that the communities in that region, they talk a lot about, their struggle and their resistance and how that's important to them. And I think that should be important for legal theory as well. And these are some of the questions that I have and that I would like to explore more, and maybe we could discuss it a little bit, how to create global alliances between those communities and other communities across the world here in Canada in order to support those communities and create a stronger network. And how those alliances can affect domestic legal regimes and international regimes as well, in a way that strengthens those reclamation practices and change the way the state deals with those issues and protects Indigenous people's rights. So those are my thoughts, and thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I do want to, I'm going to speak a little bit here, but if people do have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand once the question period does come up. I appreciate you pointing out that decentralized resistance, Rebecca, because that kind of ties into what I'm going to talk about here as well. So I'm going to share my screen and work through some things pretty quickly here as well. I want to talk very briefly again about this idea of disruption and reclamation, and I'm going to talk about our relationship to buffalo. And when I say our, I'm talking about Plains Cree. So my family is Plains Cree on my mom's side, and through my dad's side a little bit as well. From the Samson Cree Nation here in Alberta and the Battlefords area as well. And this picture here, it has relevance. This is, we call this Mustus Otsi, which is actually buffalo's navel in the language here, better known as prairie crocus for other people as well. And we have this particular story around there that I'll share in a moment here. But what I want to talk about is really the ongoing lessons we have about our relationship, not only with our food sources. So historically, buffalo were a food source for us, but how this extends to our territories and our lands around us. So I really loved the stories that Alan, Hannah, and Rebecca were sharing, where we're talking about it's not just a food source, but I think we all talked about water as being such a important part of this as well. And so that's what this story we have about Buffalo Lake. It's a creation story of this lake here in central Alberta. And I don't have time to share the whole story here, but what occurred in the story is there was a time when buffalo were becoming scarce on the prairies historically. So this community, they went into ceremony to try to be successful, to be able to nourish themselves. And eventually what occurs in this story is they were successful in a hunt, but what they weren't given was the nourishment of the buffalo, but actually this lake springs out of this buffalo. And according to this story, the community actually centers itself around this lake because it's not only home to people, to humans, to Nehiyao peoples, Plains Cree peoples, but also to animals. So buffalo actually come to the shores. They are around there all winter because it provides sustenance, all sorts of game, all sorts of plant life, medicines, are able just to live around this lake. So in this picture, the bottom picture you see here is of Buffalo Lake, actually. Here. And so we have in the story, there's a second part to it. There's a long history of living around this lake, but the second part is a buffalo actually gets wasted. It floats into the middle of the lake and it stays there in the winter and it freezes up. And this, as the story goes, the community is crossing this lake and they want to get this horn out. It's actually a little boy who cries for this horn sticking out of the lake, and a grandfather can't resist. So he attempts to take that out and it breaks through the lake. And a lot of people fell into the lake. So I was told this story as a child, and it was kind of like this ghost story sort of thing. Like you can hear people howling. As I grew older, I recognized the law that was within the story. And two of those laws here I've kind of put on this slide here. And one is we talk about Ochinewin, which is a principle that really obligates us against transgressions against non-human beings and things. And in that story, if I had time to tell the whole story, you'd see where it is. And we have this other law as well. It's called Ochinewin, which is very similar, but it's actually dealing with our speech. It means we can't talk about, for example, Buffalo peoples in a way that would be transgressing, would be taking away their livelihood, their humanity even as well. And so all these stories are within, or all these legal principles are within our stories there as well. So what we know about our historical relationship with buffalo actually follows this story, right? And so in this next slide here, you can see the destruction that has occurred to our relationship, not only with Buffalo peoples, but also Buffalo, the environments around there. And so I wanted to put this timeline here. It's obviously not to scale, but it just shows this really harsh reality that we all know about the diminishment of buffalo on the prairies. And so this estimation of between 30 to 60 million buffalo. Here we have these stories about this, like almost like creating storms of dust when these great herds would come through. So around 1830, not coincidentally, but correspondingly with the arrival of Europeans onto the southern and northern plains, we start to see these great herds diminish. And you can see this timeline, it gets pretty stark. And this period between 1870 and 1890, what occurred there was actually the commercialization of buffalo. So furs, buffalo furs were used for clothing, but also bones were used for example, like fine china and sent overseas, fertilizer as well. So that's what you see here in this one picture, is this collection of buffalo bones. That's actually where the name, the traditional name of Regina Wisconsin comes from. It actually means pile of bones, because it was, this is where it was one area where they were piled up. And then the other one, you could see this is an actual picture of Buffalo Lake. So we call it that because it actually looks like a buffalo. It's upside down here, there. And you can also see the postmark prairie around it as well. So we have a lot of farming around this lake now that hampered the ability. Even when I tell that story about buffalo coming to the shores, they could no longer do so. Fencing really hurt these herds as well. But even that life world within this lake, there's been agricultural runoff that has harmed it, all sorts of things. So all these sort of policy things that a number of people will talk about in future panels here, but also that my three panelists have talked about as well. So that is the disruption. So really this long history of disruption to this really integral relationship that we have that teaches us our laws, but also leads to our sort of connection and relationality with our environments around us. So we have this renewal. So I'm sharing with you a Plains Cree view of our relationship with buffalo, more succinctly within my family and my greater sort of family and community. But this is also shared with a number of Indigenous nations in Canada and the United States as well. And so recently we've seen this renewal through the Buffalo Treaty, a treaty of cooperation, renewal, and restoration. And this is an international treaty amongst Indigenous nations. It also includes conservation groups, NGOs, ranching and farming communities as well in these discussions. And what it is there's this commitment to land reclamation and water reclamation for buffalo, for that sort of revitalization of their livelihoods on the prairies. But also it includes buffalo when we start to think about economic, health, educational, and research policies as well. And so, so I appreciated again how Rebeca talked about decentered, even though this is a treaty and you can see it has this centralizing force. What the force of this actually is about the decenteredness of a number of communities and organizations and individuals really taking this up. And so this is a really exciting development that we're starting to see a lot of movement here towards this kind of reclamation here. Centering it a little bit more closer to home, we see this idea of Wachitawin and the relationship with Mustas, with buffalo in our communities here. So for example, I've just shared, this is actually from social media from our Musqueam communities here. When I say our, I mean Plains Cree, I'm kind of referring to my family. And there's food security. You can see they have people from the communities who are harvesting buffalo and providing them for the community at large. When we think about COVID-19 early on, this was something that was occurring in greater numbers as well, just because of the concerns and disruptions even to food systems that occurred early on as well. But also there is a, within the schools, they take part in harvesting. And what this is connecting to, it's not only just resourcing food and nourishment or nutrients, even to get that sort of molecular, but it's really tying to our cultural, spiritual, economic, historical practices as well. So I've never hunted buffalo, but I've always known their centrality in my family or our communities. And that was through our ceremonies, our stories that were continued on as well, right? And so this sort of food security efforts, it's really connected to that there. And so I appreciated how Alan set this all up for us to think about. We need the land, right? We need access to that land, and we need those relationships beyond our own territories to continue this as well. And so the final picture that we have here is that's actually from Poundmaker in Saskatchewan. They've reclaimed buffalo onto their territory, onto the reserve. There's other reserves that have done that. It's also occurred in the national parks here as well in Alberta as well. And so we can start to see this sort of full reclamation. We're starting to move towards there as well. And so I'm going to pause it there. I'm not going to tell the story of Mustasatsi because I don't have enough time here. But I just wanted to say, moving forward, food remains braided to our ceremonial, social, cultural, and territorial practices. A gift of one. So the gift of food means we have obligations to it all. So we have obligations to our territory if we're going to be taking this as well. And access to lands and waters are integral to the reclamation of our unmediated food relationships as well, is how I see it. Okay, so I'm going to stop my comments there because I know we've had a whirlwind through 4 presentations like this. I'm going to stop share. So I'm going to ask people if you have questions. I'm not sure if I can see your hands being raised, but I think that's how this works. So if you have questions you want to voice, I'll be able to see your hands and I'll call upon you. But I do have a couple questions that have come to mind in hearing my colleagues speak here. And so I'm going to direct one towards Alan first, because he's had a lot of time to sit here in the bullpen. You talked about the relationship between Indigenous nations and the Crown and that idea of sovereignty. And I just want to pose this question a little bit further about, is this, the term sovereignty, is this something that Indigenous nations should be grasping onto? Is it something, for example, as an academic like myself, I should be avoiding? How do we see that sort of relationship between territoriality and sovereignty?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, I can't suggest what anybody should grasp onto or not. I mean, people, make decisions about what politically what is best for them. Sovereignty, the notion of sovereignty, meaning a sovereign head, a monarch, looking to Thomas Hobbes and the political theory behind that. It's a, I don't know, a poor or a loosely fit label to capture, I think, the concept of autonomy. Autonomy is probably a better word, but we always, I think, look for, as Chris Statnick would say, hooks for things that would relate and carry some kind of weight across concepts and language. So, if we're talking about and we know how powerful the assertion of Crown sovereignty is. So we're talking about sovereignty in the sense of, the independence of the state and First Nations, to just say autonomy might not carry as much weight, at least conceptually. So I don't know. I mean, nations reckon with their own kind of definitions and typically statements made in their language that make sense. But the problem is sometimes is just trying to translate the impact and carrying the full weight of the meaning to have some kind of authority to understand its full impact when you're reaching across to speak to a state that asserts its own sovereignty. So yeah, it's a great question, and it's really a tangled and kind of convoluted conversation. Thanks, Darcy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alan. And I like the idea of hooks because we've talked about fishing quite a bit, I guess, here. So we can think about that. And I agree. I often I joked even in the title of this session, I fretted over it because words have this meaning and hooks, but you don't want to misconstrue or generalize, but also to understand the power of that, especially as legal practitioners. So I see we have Luke has a question. So maybe I do have a couple of questions of my own, but people are probably tired of hearing me ask questions or talk. So Luke, go ahead. You can voice your question.
Great, thanks, Darcy, and thanks for everybody for those are incredible presentations, really thought-provoking. I think my question is probably mostly directed at Alan as well, but if anybody else wants to chime in, feel free. Yeah, Alan, your presentation sort of really got me thinking about, thinking beyond hunting and fishing rights is not just the taking of the animals, but involved in the management and drawing on legal orders and traditions, the past and present within Indigenous communities. In articulating those, and I'm wondering if you have examples of that sort of thinking being put into practice, and in particular, I'm thinking of the relation between co-management, sort of the upturn and interest in that, in particular in the North. And I've read some work, particularly Paul Nadasdy has done some work in the Yukon with Kluane First Nations there, and sort of talking about that, but also some of the ways that if management becomes framed within existing bureaucratic systems of colonial governments, and how Indigenous legal orders get kind of forced into fitting into that, and some of the challenges with that, I guess. But yeah, I'm just wondering if there's examples of what you're sort of referring to, and in particular thinking with along the lines of co-management, or maybe you're thinking beyond that. So thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, conceptually, co-management, I think there's an ideal around it. Some of I mean, it's a live conversation. It's an ongoing conversation between governments, and notionally, as long as there's equality within the management, the decision-making authorities, I think that that is the goal. But I think what happens often, shared jurisdiction, the idea of shared jurisdiction or co-management, ultimately, you'll still see the Crown, whether it's in the province or territory or the federal government, there will be this final decision-making authority. So ultimately, the Crown still gets to make the final decision. And to me, that's not really co-management, although it's much more open to dialogue that way, where we, so I think that the struggle here is First Nations just exercise sole authority. And I would argue that yeah, within their territories, there should be a lot of weight given to that. It should be sole authority, but recognizing the complexity of the relationships on the land, co-management as an ideal is, I think, one that could be attainable if, and I believe the Haida Nation has been quite successful or done a great job at coming up with those kinds of shared jurisdiction authorities where the provincial government doesn't necessarily hold the final decision. So that's the only problem muddying the waters with that. And I don't know if any of my colleagues here have anything you'd like to add to that. It's a huge area of discussion for sure.
I'm looking at Hannah or Rebecca. I don't want to. I mean, I'll add on what Alan is talking about with the Haida agreements and that co-management, where it sets out that those equal boards on the decision-making tables. But some of the experiences have been that the people who sit on those tables from, for example, Canada or the province, once they leave that table, it just gets back into that regular bureaucracy of decision making. So even if they are able to say, we have a disagreement here, and they're working through it out of that relationship, often then they go back and they get their marching orders that are a little bit more coming back to there as well. Yeah, so that kind of, that power source is disrupting, even though the agreement is setting it out a little more balanced. So great question, Luke. So thank you. So I'm gonna, you can jump to those questions, Rebecca or Hannah, but I also have some other questions. And Hannah, I want to ask you about your work with Sierra Club BC, which you alluded to at the end. And just knowing the history of NGOs and environmental organizations and Indigenous territorialities, the hard history. How has your work been informed by not only your experiences, but also this kind of changing environment that you've seen with Sierra Club?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Darcy. I think, like the environmental movement as a whole, we've been going through a lot of shifts, but I think one of the biggest shifts that we've been going through, and that's most relevant to this conversation, is that as some of you might be aware, Sierra Club has a very long history of advocating for parks creation all across what's now the United States and Canada. So like 150-year-old history in the US, and then in Canada, just over a 50-year-old history. And just in the last couple of years, and this partly came from direction from our board, who Valine Brown, who's a Haida woman, was chairing at the time, we decided to move away from our history of advocating for provincial or federal parks. And now we only advocate in support of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and when they're Indigenous led and when we're invited to do so by an Indigenous nation. And I think that the distinction that has been really profound for us as an organization is kind of moving away from a model where we look at protected areas versus what can be thought of as sacrifice zones, which is a way that a lot of the way that the conservation movement has operated in this province and also elsewhere in North America. And so what we've been really learning organizationally from a lot of the Indigenous nations that are putting forward Indigenous protected and conserved areas is looking at essentially like a different model of economic relationship with the land and thinking of economies that can be based on respectful relationships with the lands and waters and all the beings that occupy them. So instead of having a model where you have a protected area where there is essentially no or extremely restricted economic activity, instead you can have functioning economic activity, economies that are operating on those protected areas. And I think this is really relevant to our conversation around food economies and food sovereignty because, and this has been an area of contention, of course, in the history of parks creation in Canada, because often in the past, there's been conflict around hunting and fishing on those territories. And so there's a different model that's being put forward, or many different models that are being put forward by Indigenous nations that are leading protected and conserved areas. So we're kind of at the beginning, organizationally at Sierra Club BC, we're at the beginning of our journey of learning to kind of nuance our own thinking and to think in terms of multiple economies and different ways that economies can function in healthy relationship with the territories. And so we're really learning from nations that we're working with or partnering from based on their economic visions for their territories about how to do that. And that slide that I was showing at the end, and I apologize, I got a bit distracted when my dog was barking there, but that is really like a piece coming from a Coast Salish legal perspective on a beginning of trying to reimagine the relationships between beings on the territories, but also to reimagine the kind of economies that can operate on the territories. And so this is really new for Sierra Club BC, but we've kind of begun some of that work that's being led by some of the Indigenous staff and board members that work with us, as well as Indigenous communities that we're partnering with on different projects.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. So I loved how you drew out that that quote from the cashback report. I haven't read it yet. I'm anxiously waiting for moments to be able to dive into it. And that has really made me think even about, that idea of economies and how we can work through what a lot of us who are working on Indigenous legal orders talk about life worlds. And there's always been, when you have more fulsome understanding of economy, that economic aspects of those life worlds and returning to those or reclaiming them, contemporizing them is really important. Yeah. So there's some great questions in the chat here, and I'm cognizant of time here. So the first one here is a question about Quebec, the river, so the Magpie River in Quebec having legal personhood. So I'm gonna put that out there, maybe just even when we think about philosophically or theoretically, what that means when personhood is given to things like rivers. So anybody who wants to answer it, but I'm giving the right of first refusal to Rebeca because Alan, I, and Hannah have talked here, but you can refuse to answer and we can move on.
Yeah, I just want to quickly share some of my thoughts about that. I love this idea. I think it's a beautiful way of looking at rivers as having rights. But in the end of the day, I know behind all this, there are people, right? So I think we need to think of this as a relational problem. So, and also the relationship between states and the communities and how they're going to voice those rights and the interests of those beings, in this case, rivers. So I don't know, it's not, law is not something magical, right? It's not something that you just recognize rights and it will happen immediately. So it all depends on people and how they see their responsibilities towards those beings, I think.
Yeah, I agree, Rebecca. I think about the interpretive communities that are going to be, interpreting what those rights mean is really important as well. Like, so for example, the Magpie River, in that example, it's there's rights for regeneration, right to flow. So what does regeneration mean? So then it kind of goes back to Alan talking about sovereignty. Like, there's going to be an interpretation there, and who's doing the interpretation is really important, right? Yeah. Alan or Hannah, do you have thoughts on legal personhood to things like rivers and how that can help or engage or hinder when we think about reclamation of Indigenous territoriality?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always kind of problematize the idea of rights generally being, this concept, this in liberalism, rooted in liberalism. But I think if we look to Indigenous legal orders, as Rebecca was saying, it's a matter of relationality and knowing what your obligations, your responsibilities are to others. And rivers are living entities, active agents within the world, within relationship with everything else that relies on the river and being in relation to the river. And I think, so as you were talking about interpretation, who gets to interpret what the rights are, or when you're talking about a decision about land use, who's making that decision speaking for the river. But I think if you understand or know or learn about the legal order around that rights basis, so not Canadian, not entrenched in Canadian law, but in an Indigenous legal order. Once you understand what those legal obligations and responsibilities are, I think the decisions start to become clear, and there's less need to interpret because people will just understand what you can do and what you can't do. But so really a knowledge of the legal order to understand what we mean by when we say the river has rights.
Yeah, I'm not going to put you on the spot. Hannah, what's your dog's name, by the way?
Toby.
Toby,
He's
okay.
had more of a presence today than I would have ideally liked.
It's been great. It's been great. And so, Hannah, do you have any thoughts on this, or I just don't want to move on if you.
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate what Rebecca and Alan said in terms of that emphasis on relationality, and just for myself as a settler person, I really appreciate learning about how to enact those reciprocal obligations. And for me, I've found that some of the conversations around legal personhood in other jurisdictions have really been generative in terms of starting those conversations, both between settlers and Indigenous communities, and helping for those of us who are settlers to reconceptualize what those legal relationships might look like with a foundation of reciprocity. And so, but yeah, I acknowledge, as Alan said too, that there's a lot of complication, and the kind of some of the liberal thinking models that's been embedded in create a lot of complexity. So
yeah,
it's complicated.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. Rebecca, you have a comment?
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to interfere in your role as a moderator, but there's a question for you, Darcy, as well. You are being a too generous moderator and giving the floor to us, but maybe you should share a little bit.
I was gonna get there.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, thank you. We have 2 minutes left, so maybe I should get to this here. But one, thank you for whoever put this Atlantic article there that talks about national parks and that history in the United States and Indigenous nations there. I encourage people to read that. That kind of goes about what Hannah was talking about as well. Yeah, and so this is a great question. I would say it's not. They've intensified, and it's really been like this older sort of. I mentioned the word Wechitowin in my presentation, and that means aiding, right? And this is actually a legal principle. So that's what we've seen in times of crisis, aiding amongst Cree people, but also for moving out towards communities as well. So it's not only been through food, but we've seen this, I know for the Musqueam communities, even potatoes have been offered in huge pallets, and people doing that. And so it's something that's continued, and just the recognition of the emergency means that we're going to continue this historical practice. So it has intensified there. But you can also look at other Indigenous nations. I know the Blackfoot people in the United States, they were sharing extra vaccine doses at the border to Cardston, which is just a community, mostly Mormon community of non-Indigenous people for the most part. So just that idea of mutual aid is really within all of these legal traditions is really popped up there as well. Yeah, so really great question, and sorry I don't have time to go through more of the answers here. So we're in our last minute. I just want to conclude by thanking Alan, Hannah, and Rebecca for sharing their experiences and their relationships and their research here. They are very modest people, but I always learn so much from hearing the three of you speak. So I was grateful to be a part of this. Thank you for everybody who attended here and to have this space. And yeah, just really looking forward to the continued conversations, the overlaps, the contrasts that are going to go on in the other sessions here. So with that, I'm going to end here. And again, people be well and take care.